The auctioneer's gavel had barely risen into the air when the lone feminine voice cut through the crowd of dusty-booted men like a sharp knife through warm butter, and every jaw in Caldwell, Kansas dropped clean to the dirt. The year was 1879, and the summer heat pressed down on the town of Caldwell like a hot iron on a cotton shirt, baking the unpainted wooden storefronts and turning the main street into something that resembled the floor of a dry riverbed. Caldwell sat right along the Kisham Trail, a cattle town through and through, full of cowboys who smelled of leather and horse sweat, saloon keepers who watered down their whiskey, and land speculators who circled struggling ranches the way buzzards circled dying cattle. It was not a place that showed much mercy to the weak, and the Diamond Creek Ranch had been weak for going on 3 years now. Elias Colt stood inside the main barn of Diamond Creek, watching through a wide gap in the weathered wooden planks as the auction unfolded outside. He pressed one large, calloused hand flat against the rough wood and leaned forward until the brim of his hat nearly touched the siding. His jaw was set hard, his dark eyes tracking every face in that crowd. He was 28 years old, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of lean, sun-darkened face that spoke of years spent under an open sky. He had worked Diamond Creek Ranch for the better part of 4 years, and every one of those years had carved something into him that he could not quite name. This ranch was not his by deed, but it felt like his in every way that mattered. The man who had owned Diamond Creek was a Scot by the name of Wallace Greer, who had come to Kansas from Edinburgh with a chest full of ambition and a head full of dreams about running cattle across open American land. For the first 2 years, Wallace had done all right. He and Elias had built something real together out on that stretch of grassland along the creek. But then the hard winter of 1876 had taken half the herd, and the dry summer of 1877 had turned the grazing land to cracked earth, and Wallace had borrowed money from the Caldwell Territorial Bank at rates that were anything but fair. By the spring of 1878, Wallace was coughing blood into his handkerchief, and by that autumn, he was laid out in the small cemetery behind the cottonwood trees with a simple granite marker bearing his name. Wallace had no family to speak of, no wife, no children. He had left the ranch and all its debts to the bank, along with a handwritten note to Elias that said simply, "You are the best man I ever knew, son. I am sorry I cannot leave you more than this." Elias had folded that note and tucked it inside his vest pocket, and it had stayed there ever since, worn soft at the creases from being taken out and read too many times. The bank had spent the better part of a year trying to find a buyer through private means, but Diamond Creek Ranch was a struggling proposition. The north fence line had collapsed in 2 places, the well near the south pasture had gone brackish, and the cattle that remained numbered fewer than 100 head. Any man with serious money to spend was looking at stronger operations. The bank finally resorted to a public auction, posting notices from Caldwell all the way down to Wichita, and the morning of that auction had brought out a collection of men who were mostly there to lowball the property into an insult. Elias had watched them arrive all morning. Silas Horn was there, a land speculator from Wichita who had a reputation for buying distressed properties, stripping them of whatever was useful, and then selling the bare land for profit while leaving the hands who worked it without so much as a week's wages. He stood near the front of the assembled crowd, his expensive Eastern suit already darkening under the arms from the heat, a smug expression arranged on his wide, fleshy face. There were 2 other men, local cattlemen named Briggs and Dempsey, who Elias suspected were there more out of competitive spite toward each other than out of genuine interest in the property. Then there were a handful of men Elias did not recognize, men who had likely ridden in from out of town following the auction notices. And then there was her. She had arrived on the morning stage from Wichita, stepping down onto the Caldwell Main Street with a carpetbag in one hand and a folded paper document tucked under her arm. Elias had seen her from a distance when he walked to the barn to avoid standing in the crowd with men who were picking over the bones of a place he loved. She was perhaps 24 or 25, tall for a woman, with dark auburn hair pinned up beneath a practical straw hat that had seen better days. She wore a deep blue traveling dress that was dusty at the hem from the road, and she moved through the assembled crowd with a kind of quiet, deliberate purpose that made men step out of her way without quite knowing why they were doing it. He had thought she was perhaps the wife of one of the bidders, there to observe while her husband conducted business. It had not entered his mind even once that she might be there to bid. The auctioneer, a reedy man named Harold Fitch who worked for the Caldwell Territorial Bank, climbed up onto the back of a flatbed wagon that had been positioned in front of the ranch house and began his practice patter. He described the property in terms that were optimistic to the point of outright fabrication, praising the fertile creek bottom land, the well-constructed main barn, and the solid ranch house, while glossing over the collapsed fencing, the struggling herd, and the outstanding debt that would transfer to any buyer. The bidding started low, as Elias expected. Horn opened at $800. Briggs countered with $850 out of pure reflexive competition. One of the unknown men raised it to $900. And then the bidding stalled, the way it always stalls when men who are not entirely convinced of what they're buying start looking sideways at each other. That was when she raised her hand. $1,000, she said, and her voice was clear and steady and carried across the hot Kansas air without a tremor in it. Every man in that assembled crowd turned to look at her. Harold Fitch paused mid-sentence, his gavel hovering in the air. Sela's horn turned around so fast that the brim of his hat nearly spun loose from his head. Briggs and Dempsey exchanged a look that contained equal parts confusion and affront, as though the prairie itself had spoken out of turn. Inside the barn, Elias Colt pulled back from the gap in the planks and stared at nothing for a full 3 seconds. Then he was back at the gap, eyes wide, watching. She did not flinch under the weight of all those stares. She stood with her carpetbag at her feet and her chin lifted just slightly, and she waited for the auctioneer to recover himself and continue. Horn recovered first. He turned back to the auctioneer and raised a hand. $1,100. $1,200, she said immediately, before Fitch even had time to register the raise. The murmur that went through the crowd was low and uncomfortable, the sound of men who did not know what to make of something they had no framework for. Women did not bid at property auctions. It was not that there was a law against it exactly, but it simply did not happen in Caldwell, Kansas in the summer of 1879. Land was men's business. Cattle were men's business. The financial machinery of the frontier was, by unspoken but iron consensus, men's business. Horn's face had gone the color of a fresh brick. He raised his hand again. $1,300. Elias watched her. She did not look rattled. She looked like a woman who had done arithmetic very carefully before boarding the stage from Wichita, and who knew precisely how far she could go and precisely how far she intended to go. $1,400, she said. Horn turned and looked at her fully, and there was something ugly in the look of a man who considers a challenge to his authority as a personal offense. $1,500, he said, louder than necessary, and a couple of the men around him nodded in approval. The woman reached into her carpetbag with one hand and produced a folded document which she opened and examined briefly, then folded again. Whatever she read there seemed to settle something in her. $1,600, she said. Harold Fitch was sweating through his collar. He looked between the woman and Horn with the desperate expression of a man who had been given a simple job that had suddenly become very complicated. Horn's jaw worked. He looked at the ranch house, at the barn, at the scraggly herd visible through the paddock rails, and Elias could see the man doing his own arithmetic, recalculating whether the land speculation profit still made sense at this price. After a long, heavy pause, Horn raised his chin and said nothing. He did not raise his hand. Fitch looked around the crowd. The other bidders were silent. Briggs and Dempsey had already quietly decided they wanted no part of this particular scene. $1,600 going once, Fitch said, his voice pitching upward slightly with uncertainty. Going twice. He paused. Nobody spoke. The gavel came down. Sold to the young lady, for $1,600. The silence that followed was the loudest silence Elias Colt had ever heard in his life, and standing inside the barn, his hand still pressed flat against the rough wood of the plank wall, Elias realized his mouth had been hanging open for the better part of the last 2 minutes. He closed it slowly. He looked down at his boots. He looked back up through the gap at the woman who had just bought the ranch he had spent 4 years loving. She was smiling now, a small and private smile, and she bent to pick up her carpetbag and walked toward Harold Fitch to complete the paperwork, stepping through the crowd of silent, staring men like a ship moving through still water. Elias stepped back from the wall and sat down heavily on a hay bale. He had to talk to her. He had to know who she was, what she planned to do with the property, and most importantly, whether she intended to keep him on. He had nowhere else to go, not really. He had put down roots here the way a cottonwood puts down roots near water, quietly and deeply and over a long time, until the roots are so tangled in the earth that pulling them up would kill something important. He sat there for perhaps 10 minutes, listening to the crowd outside disperse, listening to the shuffle of boots and the low murmur of conversation and the eventual sound of horses moving away. Then he heard the creak of the barn door. She came in out of the direct sunlight, and for a moment Elias just watched her as his eyes adjusted. She set her carpetbag down just inside the door and looked around the barn with steady, assessing eyes that moved across the stalls, the hayloft, the old rusted iron of the water trough with the efficiency of someone who was making an actual evaluation rather than just looking around. "I know you are in here," she said, without looking directly at him. "I saw the gap in the planks where someone was watching the auction." Elias stood up from the hay bale and pulled off his hat. "Yes, ma'am. My name is Elias Colt. I work this ranch." She looked at him then. Her eyes were green, a shade of green that reminded him of the creek when it was running clean and deep after spring rain. She looked at him the way she had looked at the barn, measuring, thoughtful but not unkind. "Margaret Hale," she said, "and from what I understand, you know this ranch better than anyone alive." Elias turned his hat in his hands. "Yes, ma'am. 4 years this coming October." "Then I need your help," she said simply. "I have bought a property I have never set foot on until this morning, and I have a great deal to learn very quickly if I am going to make anything of it." Something in his chest rearranged itself slightly, a shift he could not immediately identify. "What made you buy it?" he asked. It was a forward question, perhaps too forward, but she did not seem like a woman who would be troubled by directness. She was quiet for a moment, and then she crossed to the nearest stall and rested one hand on the rail and looked at the old roan mare inside it. "My father was a rancher in Missouri," she said. "He ran cattle on 120 acres along the Missouri River. When he died 2 years ago, my mother and I were cheated out of the land by the men administering the estate. They said we had no legal standing to inherit, and the land went to a second cousin none of us had ever met." She stroked the roan's nose once. "I swore then that one day I would have land of my own with my name on the deed, land that no one could take from me because I was a woman who did not count. I have been working as a bookkeeper in Wichita for 2 years, saving every cent I could, and when I saw the notice for this auction I thought perhaps this was the place." Elias was quiet for a moment. He understood loss of something you considered yours. He understood it very well. "The land is good," he said at last. "Better than it probably looked to the men out there today. The problems are manageable ones if you have the will and the time and someone who knows the ground." She turned from the mare and looked at him again. "Are you willing to stay on? I cannot pay what a man of your experience ought to earn, not yet, but I can give you fair wages once the ranch begins to produce, and I will not take advantage of you." He did not hesitate. "Yes, ma'am, I am staying." Something in her expression softened very slightly, just the smallest degree, as though she had been bracing for a different answer. "Good," she said. "Then show me everything." He showed her everything that first afternoon, walking the property from the north fence line to the south pasture in the grinding heat, pointing out the collapsed sections of fencing, the location of the brackish well, the condition of the remaining cattle, the state of the vegetable garden behind the house that had gone mostly to seed. He watched her take it all in without flinching, without the look of someone realizing they had made a terrible mistake, and he found himself revising his first impression of her upward steadily as the afternoon wore on. She asked intelligent questions. She knew the difference between cattle that were underweight from drought stress and cattle that were sick because she had grown up watching for both. She understood what the collapsed north fence meant in terms of grazing range and loss. When she looked at the brackish well, she frowned and said, "The water table has shifted. If we dig out 50 yards to the east toward the creek, we can likely tap cleaner water." Elias stared at her. He had been thinking the same thing for 6 months. By the time the evening light came in low and golden across the Kansas grass, they had walked most of the property and Elias had begun to feel something unfamiliar, a cautious lifting of the weight that had been sitting on his chest since Wallace died. He had been running this ranch alone and in limbo for the better part of a year, making decisions with no authority to make them, spending his own small savings on feed when the bank's provision ran dry, holding the whole precarious thing together through sheer stubbornness. Having someone who actually owned the land, someone who seemed to have real intention and intelligence behind her purchase, changed things in a way he had not expected. What he had not expected even more was the way she laughed. They were coming back along the creek bank near the end of the property walk when one of the younger steers, a cantankerous black and white animal that Elias had privately named Contrary on account of his personality, trotted over to investigate them, and then apparently decided Margaret was carrying something interesting, because he thrust his big wide nose into her carpet bag, which she had insisted on carrying for the afternoon so she could take notes, and came out with her folded property deed dangling from his teeth. Elias lunged for the steer, who tossed his head and danced sideways. Margaret stood for half a second with her hand outstretched, watching the most important document she owned flapping from the jaws of a cow, and then she laughed. Not a polite laugh, not a restrained and ladylike laugh, but a real one, full and warm, that rose up out of her like something she had been carrying around compressed and finally set free. The sound of it hit Elias somewhere between his ribs, and he was so startled by the sensation that he nearly missed catching Contrary's halter. He recovered the deed, more or less intact except for a damp corner where the steer had gotten a good hold, and turned to hand it back to her and found her still laughing, pressing one hand over her mouth now, her green eyes bright. "My deed," she managed, "has been chewed by a cow." "He does that," Elias said. "He took my hat 3 times last month." She looked at him, and the laughter settled into a warm smile that stayed on her face even as she took the deed back and carefully smoothed the damp corner. And something happened in that moment that Elias would later think of as the first crack in the careful, professional distance he had immediately imposed on himself when she walked into the barn. It was nothing he could point to, nothing that would have been visible to anyone watching. It was just a small internal shift, the way the earth shifts sometimes before a bigger movement, slow and deep and certain. He told himself firmly that she was his employer. He had work to do. In the days that followed, they settled into the hard, grinding rhythm of rebuilding a struggling ranch. Elias rose before first light every morning and had already been through the cattle check and started the morning feed by the time Margaret came out of the ranch house with 2 tin cups of strong coffee, handing one to him without comment. She had taken to rising early herself, which surprised him. Many of the townswomen he had encountered treated the frontier as something to be endured from indoors. Margaret treated it as her place. She had hired on 2 additional hands within the first week, young brothers named Tom and Pete Sellers who were looking for work after their own family's attempt at farming had failed 2 seasons running. They were good workers, strong and willing, and they looked at Margaret with a mixture of uncertainty and respect that gradually resolved itself into simply respect as she proved she could hold her own in the day-to-day decisions. Elias organized the repair of the north fence line, a brutal week of hauling posts and stretching wire in the July heat. Margaret worked alongside them, not in a way that was showy or trying to prove something, but simply in the practical way of someone who understood that work needed doing and that extra hands mattered. She drove the supply wagon to town herself, negotiating with the hardware merchant for fencing materials at a price that made Elias raise his eyebrows when she told him. "He tried to charge me 15% over the standard rate," she said matter-of-factly, climbing down from the wagon seat. "I told him I had the Caldwell Territorial Bank's itemized records of what they had paid him for supplies, which I did not, but I had heard Wallace Greer discuss prices with him twice, and I remembered the figures, and he came down quickly enough." Elias looked at her. "You bluffed a hardware merchant." "I implied a thing I did not state directly," she said, and there was that smile again, quick and private. "There is a difference." He laughed before he could stop himself, and she glanced at him sideways with something that might have been pleasure at the sound. They worked on the well in the second week, hiring a well digger from town named Amos Bell, who was old and slow and extraordinarily good at finding water. He confirmed Margaret's instinct about moving east toward the creek, and they had clean water by the end of a 3-day dig. The brackish well was sealed off. Small victories, Elias told himself, but each one felt like a brick being laid in a foundation. He tried to maintain the professional distance he had set himself. He gave clear reports each evening, standing on the porch of the ranch house while she sat in the wooden chair and made notes in her ledger book. He addressed her as Miss Hale. He was efficient and practical and careful. He went back to his bunk in the hands' quarters each night and lay staring at the ceiling and told himself that everything was proceeding appropriately. But the days were long and the work was close, and the prairie had a way of stripping everything down to its essential nature. When you work beside someone in serious heat, when you share the weight of difficult problems, when you sit together at the end of an exhausting day watching the sunset bleed red and orange across the endless Kansas sky, the careful professional distances you have erected tend to quietly, insistently dissolve. He started noticing things he should not have been noticing. The way she chewed the end of her pencil when she was working through a calculation she found difficult. The way she talked to the horses when she thought no one could hear her, low and gentle and funny. The way you talk to creatures you trust completely. The way she had quietly, without any announcement, begun keeping an extra portion of coffee warm in the mornings, and how the extra portion was always exactly the right temperature when Elias came in from the cattle check. He noticed the way she sat up very straight when she was being challenged, which happened with some frequency because not everyone in Caldwell had accepted her purchase of the ranch with grace. Sela's Horn, stung by his loss at the auction, had taken to making dismissive comments in town about the foolishness of a woman trying to run a cattle operation. The Caldwell Territorial Bank's representative, a man named Carter Briggs, who was no relation to the bidder at the auction, had twice come out to the ranch to go over the terms of the remaining debt in a manner that Elias found to be distinctly hostile in its subtext, emphasizing payment deadlines and default clauses in a way that was clearly intended to unsettle her. Margaret listened to Carter Briggs with that straight-backed composure, asked precise questions about every clause he referenced, and then walked him back to his horse with such deliberate and gracious politeness that the man left looking oddly defeated even though he had technically just delivered a series of financial warnings. "He wants me to fail," she said to Elias after Briggs had ridden away, and there was no heat in her voice, just clear-eyed acknowledgement of fact. "Yes," Elias said. There was no point in pretending otherwise. Most of the bank's lending terms were written when Wallace was still alive. The bank did not expect to be dealing with a woman, and some of the men there would consider it a correction of an embarrassing situation if you defaulted. She was quiet for a moment, looking out across the pasture at her cattle. He was still getting used to thinking it that way. Then we will make sure I do not default, she said. Yes, he said again, and he meant it with a conviction that had moved well past professional obligation, though he was still pretending to himself that it had not. The cattle drive changed things. By late August, Margaret had assessed the herd carefully and concluded that the best financial move was to take the strongest animals, perhaps 60 head, down to the railroad at Caldwell for sale before the fall, using the income to pay down the most pressing portion of the bank debt and purchase winter supplies. It was the right call. Elias had been thinking the same thing. 60 head was not a large drive by any measure, just the two of them and the seller's brothers covering perhaps 12 miles, but a drive was a drive, and the logistics and physical demands of it were real. They left before sunrise on a Tuesday morning, the stars still sharp overhead, the air holding the first fragile hint of autumn coolness that would not last the day, but was beautiful for that first hour. Margaret rode a dark bay gelding she had purchased with money she had saved separately from the ranch purchase fund, a solid, sensible horse she had named Franklin. She handled him with easy confidence, and watching her cut back a straying steer in those first miles reminded Elias that she had grown up on horseback. It was during the second evening of the drive, camped along a creek bend with the herd settled and the seller's brothers on watch, that the distance finally collapsed entirely. They were sitting by the fire, not talking much, the way people who have spent a full day working hard together sometimes do not need to talk. The fire burned low, and overhead the sky was the kind of black and enormous that you only get far from town, absolutely crowded with stars. Margaret had her ledger book open across her knees but had not written anything in it for a while, just sitting with her pencil still in her hand, and her face turned slightly upward toward the sky. My father used to say that every star was a rancher who had gone on ahead to see if the grazing was better, she said. Elias looked up at the sky and then at her. And is it? I used to think he was being funny, she said. Now I think he meant it as a comfort, that the people you lose are not just gone but somewhere more spacious. She paused. I miss him every day, but I think he would have liked this particular view from this particular camp on the way to selling cattle that are mine. Elias was quiet for a moment. Wallace would have liked you, he said. He was the kind of man who appreciated people who did not let the world tell them what shape they were allowed to be. She looked at him. In the firelight her face was warm and open in a way it was not always open in the daylight, when there was always something practical to be navigated. Tell me about him, she said. You never talk about him. So Elias talked about Wallace Greer. He talked about the man's impractical optimism and his genuine decency, and his stubborn refusal to understand that American weather was fundamentally different from Scottish weather. He talked about the time Wallace had tried to plant a kitchen garden and been insulted when the Kansas summer dispatched it within 3 weeks. He talked about the note in his pocket, and he took it out and read it aloud without quite planning to, and when he finished, the fire crackled softly in the silence. That is a beautiful thing to be given, Margaret said. Her voice was quiet. Yes, Elias said. He refolded the note. I did not want to leave after he died. Even when the bank was being difficult, even when there was nothing official keeping me here, I could not make myself go. It felt like leaving him behind in a way that was different from him just being gone. She reached across and put her hand briefly over his where it rested on his knee, not gripping, not pressing, just resting there for a moment like a warm acknowledgement. I am glad you stayed, she said. He turned his hand over without entirely meaning to, and for one moment her fingers curled against his palm, and then she drew her hand back and looked at the fire, and Elias looked at the fire too, and neither of them said anything, and the night settled around them full of crickets and the breathing of cattle, and something that neither of them had words for yet. The cattle sold well in Caldwell. Margaret negotiated with the cattle buyer with the same calm, precise method she used for everything, and she came away with a price that covered the most pressing portion of the bank debt, with enough left over for winter supplies, and a modest amount set aside. On the ride back to Diamond Creek, she seemed lighter, as though something she had been carrying internally had been partially set down. Tom and Pete Sellers rode ahead. Elias rode beside Margaret, and the morning had that particular quality of good Kansas autumn air, crisp and clear and smelling faintly of dry grass and distance. They rode for a while without speaking, and then Margaret said, "Elias." It was the first time she had used his given name. He felt it in his chest. "I want to thank you," she said. Not in a formal way, not in the way I should have said it earlier in some official manner, but truly. You did not have to stay when I bought this property. You did not know me. You could have left and found work somewhere else, somewhere with better conditions and a more established operation. But you stayed, and you have worked harder than I had any right to expect, and I think without you this would have already been much harder than it was. He thought about what to say and chose honesty. "I did not stay entirely for professional reasons," he said. He kept his eyes forward on the trail. "I stayed because this land matters to me. But I have also stayed because working alongside you has been the most interesting thing that has happened to me in 4 years." He paused. "That is not what I planned to say." She was quiet beside him for a moment. "What did you plan to say?" "Something more appropriate." She laughed, and he felt that warm shift again, deeper now, more unmistakable. "I appreciate the unplanned version more," she said. He looked at her then, and she was already looking at him, and there was nothing guarded in her expression, just the same direct clarity she brought to everything, turned fully on him. "Miss Hale," he started. "Margaret," she said. He took a slow breath. "Margaret. I do not want to make things complicated for you here. You are building something real and important, and the last thing you need is trouble from the man who works your ranch." "Do you think that is what this would be?" she asked. "Trouble?" He had no honest answer to that, because every honest answer led somewhere that frightened him a little and attracted him completely. "I think," she said carefully, "that some things are worth being a little complicated." She turned her face forward again toward the trail. "I am not asking for anything. I am just saying that I see you, Elias. I have seen you since that first afternoon in the barn, and I think you are worth seeing." He rode the rest of the way home with something unfamiliar settled over him, something that felt like standing in the sun after being indoors for a long time, warm and real, and making him want to squint until his eyes adjusted. October came to Diamond Creek with the particular beauty and ferocity that the Kansas fall always brought, the tall grass gone gold and bronze, the sky a deep brilliant blue on the clear days and a low charging gray on the storm days, and there was always a week of each. They worked through it steadily, preparing for winter, laying in supplies, making sure the structures were sound and the cattle had adequate shelter and feed. The Sellers brothers had grown genuinely fond of the ranch, and of Margaret in the particular loyal way of young men who have been treated fairly for perhaps the first time in their working lives. Pete, the younger one, had taken it upon himself to repair the weather vane on top of the barn without being asked, and it spun cheerfully in the October wind. Elias and Margaret moved around each other in the way of people who are both aware of something and choosing to let it develop at its own pace, which is both the most cautious and the most charged way to exist in proximity to someone you are falling in love with. They had dinner together most evenings at the kitchen table in the ranch house, which Margaret had begun inviting him to after the cattle drive, saying practically that it was more efficient to discuss the next day's work over a meal than to do it standing on the porch. He had agreed with absolute and complete solemnity, and they both knew it was not about efficiency. She was a good cook, practical rather than elaborate, the kind of cooking that comes from growing up in a household where food had to be made rather than simply prepared. He brought things from the garden and sometimes from hunting, and on the evenings when the work had been particularly successful, they sometimes shared a small glass of the good bourbon she kept in the back of the kitchen cupboard, which she had brought from Wichita in her carpet bag, along with her deed and her ledger and her carefully folded plans for a life. He learned her over those evenings. He learned that she was funny in a dry, observational way that sneaked up on you. He learned that she read everything she could get her hands on, that the small collection of books on the shelf in the main room of the ranch house was hers, and had grown significantly since she arrived, because when she went to town, she almost always came back with something from the general store that carried a small selection of novels and periodicals. He learned that she had strong opinions about land management practices, and was not shy about expressing them, even when those opinions differed from his, and that she was always willing to hear out the counterargument and genuinely revise her thinking if the counterargument was better. He learned that she was lonely in a way she did not talk about directly, but that showed itself in small things, in the particular attentiveness she brought to any real conversation, in the way she saved interesting things she had read to tell him in the evenings, in the way she had quickly and quietly become fond of the animals, not just practically but affectionately, talking to them by name as she moved through her days. She learned him too. He could tell. She asked questions that were specific to him rather than to his function as a ranch hand, asking about where he was from, about how he had come to be in Kansas, about what he had done before Wallace. He told her about growing up in Tennessee, about a father who had been a decent man but a restless one, who had pulled the family across 3 states before Elias was 15. He told her about coming west at 18, because the frontier felt like a place where a man could be what he made himself rather than what he had been given. He told her about the various ranches he had worked, about learning the cattle trade from an old Mexican vaquero named Aurelio, who had been the best horseman Elias had ever seen, and who had taught him that patience was the most important skill in working with animals, and probably with most people too. She listened with her full attention, the way she did everything. One evening in late October, a cold front came through and the temperature dropped sharply overnight, and Elias, doing the early morning cattle check in the gray pre-dawn, found that one of the fences in the north pasture had come down under the weight of ice accumulation on the wire. He had it repaired by mid-morning, but not before losing track of 6 head who had wandered through the gap. He and Tom spent most of the day rounding them up across the neighboring land, which belonged to an older rancher named Harold Pickett, who was neighborly enough about it, and helped them without complaint. He came in that evening tired and cold and later than usual, and Margaret had held dinner and was sitting at the kitchen table with a book, a lamp burning at her elbow, the wood stove going strong against the cold. She looked up when he came in and set his hat and coat on the peg and said nothing about the lateness, just said, "I kept the stew warm," and got up to serve it. He sat at the table and she set a bowl in front of him and poured the coffee and sat down across from him with her book, not talking, not requiring conversation, just present, and the simple human warmth of it after a cold and difficult day hit him somewhere deep. He looked at her across the table. The lamplight caught the auburn in her hair and the particular softness of her expression when she was absorbed in reading, and he thought, with a sudden and complete clarity that he had been approaching for weeks, that he was in love with her, not on the way to it, not considering the possibility of it, but fully and simply already there. He set down his coffee cup. "Margaret," she looked up from her book. "I need to say something," he said, "and I am going to say it plainly because I think you prefer that." "I do," she said, and she closed the book. "I love you," he said. "I am aware that is a significant thing to say to your employer who you have known for 4 months, and I am not saying it to make anything difficult or to put you in a position. I am saying it because I think you deserve to know it and because I am not good at carrying things I cannot say out loud." He paused. "You do not have to say anything back. I just wanted you to know." She looked at him for a long moment, and her expression moved through something he could not entirely read, a kind of surprised recognition, as though she had been thinking a thought that she had not known he was also thinking. "Elias Colt," she said, and her voice was very soft. "I have been in love with you since you came out of that barn and introduced yourself, and then looked so worried about saying the wrong thing that you forgot to put your hat back on for the next 10 minutes. He laughed, a startled, honest laugh, and she smiled at him across the table with her whole face, not the small private smile, the full one, the real one. And in the warm lamplight of the ranch kitchen on a cold October night, with the stove crackling and the wind pressing against the windows, he reached across the table and she met him halfway. Winter came down over Diamond Creek Ranch with the particular heavy intention of a Kansas winter, and they moved through it together with the comfortable closeness of people who have finally stopped pretending something is not true. There was a propriety they maintained, the world of 1879 being what it was, but there was also a kind of steady, open happiness between them that the Sellers brothers registered with grins they attempted, unsuccessfully, to hide. Elias proposed to Margaret in early December, formally and carefully, sitting beside her on the porch on one of those cold, bright afternoons that the Kansas winter produces between its storms, when the air is still and sharp and the light turns everything silver. He had no ring yet, but he had thought about what he wanted to say for a long time, and he said it well. She accepted without hesitation, and then laughed and said, "I have been waiting for you to do that for 6 weeks." "I wanted to be sure," he said. "Were you not sure after October?" she asked. "I was sure," he said. "I wanted to be sure you were sure." She shook her head at him with a fond exasperation that he had come to love as much as anything else about her. "Elias, I'm always sure about the things that matter." They were married in Caldwell in February of 1880, on a day when the sky was the cold, clear blue of deep winter, the kind of blue that looks like something beyond the sky itself. The ceremony was performed by the circuit preacher who came through Caldwell every 2 months, a practical man named Reverend Hooper, who conducted the service briskly and warmly in the same way he did everything else. The Sellers brothers were there, scrubbed and combed to an uncomfortable degree, standing solemnly on one side of the small gathering. Harold Pickett, the neighboring rancher, came with his wife, a stout and kind woman named Ruth who had taken a visible liking to Margaret and who wept quietly throughout the ceremony with the pleasant enjoyment of someone who attends too few weddings. A woman named Clara Marsh was there too, the wife of the dry goods merchant, who had been one of the first people in Caldwell to treat Margaret with straightforward friendship after the auction, inviting her to the monthly Women's Literary Society with a matter-of-factness that Margaret had told Elias privately was one of the kindest things anyone had done for her in Caldwell. Margaret wore a dress the color of winter sky, made by her own hands over 3 weeks of evenings, and she walked into that ceremony looking like everything Elias had ever imagined and nothing he had ever quite managed to picture. He stood at the front of that small gathering with his hands clasped in front of him and watched her come down the simple aisle they had made between the chairs in the small church, and he thought he had never in his life been more certain of anything. When Reverend Hooper pronounced them married, Ruth Pickett's quiet weeping escalated pleasantly. Pete Sellers forgot himself and let out a whoop that echoed off the church ceiling, and Elias kissed his wife in front of everyone with a complete lack of self-consciousness that surprised even him. The spring of 1880 was kinder to Diamond Creek than the springs before it. The rains came at approximately the right times and in approximately the right amounts, which on the Kansas plains is never guaranteed and always appreciated. The new well produced clean, reliable water. The north fence line held. The herd, carefully managed through the winter on the feed they had put by, came through in reasonable condition. Margaret, who had been managing the ranch's financial books with the precision of the professional bookkeeper she had been, was able to report in March that they were on track to meet the spring payment to the Caldwell Territorial Bank without difficulty. Carter Briggs, who came out in April to collect the payment, had the look of a man who has been quietly hoping for a different outcome and is obliged to accept the one he has received. Silas Horn had, over the winter, apparently decided that Caldwell itself was no longer sufficiently profitable for his speculation activities, and he had moved his operations to Dodge City. Nobody at Diamond Creek missed him. The ranch grew slowly and steadily. the way real things grow. By late spring, Margaret had decided they should expand the herd modestly, purchasing 12 additional head from Harold Pickett, who was reducing his own operation as he got older. Tom Sellers had turned out to be exceptionally good with horses, and he began breaking and training horses on the side, which added a small but consistent additional income stream. Pete had discovered a talent for fixing machinery and had become something of a local resource for neighboring ranches when equipment broke down. And Elias found himself doing something he had never done before, which was planning for the future. Not just the ranch's future in the practical operational sense, but his own future in the long-rooted sense that he had never previously allowed himself. He had always been a man who lived in the immediate term, partly from temperament and partly from the experience of never having had somewhere that felt permanent enough to project into. Now he found himself thinking about what the ranch would look like in 10 years, in 20. About what the creek bottom land could support if it was managed carefully over time. About the repairs he wanted to make to the ranch house, a wider porch, a second window in the kitchen to let in the morning light the way Margaret had mentioned once and then never mentioned again. He began building that second window in June, working on it in the evenings, and when he revealed it on a Saturday morning, she stood in the kitchen looking at the light it let in and was quiet for a moment in a way that told him she remembered having said that and had not expected him to remember too. "Elias," she said. "You said you wanted the morning light," he said. She turned around and looked at him with a fullness in her expression that he had learned to receive without looking away, even though it still had the capacity to undo him somewhat. "I did say that," she said. And then she walked over and held his face in her hands and kissed him with a thoroughness that made him understand, not for the first time, how very lucky he was. The summer of 1880 brought visitors that neither of them had anticipated. Margaret's mother, a woman named Helen Hale, had been living in St. Joseph, Missouri since the loss of the family property, taking in sewing and managing on very little. When Margaret had written to tell her she had bought a ranch and married, she had received a letter back that was equal parts disbelief, joy, and dignified maternal concern. After a careful correspondence over several months, Margaret had proposed that Helen come and live with them on Diamond Creek, and Helen, after a period of consideration that was probably shorter than she admitted, had agreed. Helen Hale arrived in July on the Wichita stage, smaller than Elias had imagined her and sharper than he had expected, with the same direct green eyes as her daughter, and a manner of assessing people that reminded him somewhat of the way Margaret had looked around the barn on that first afternoon. She looked at him for a long and searching moment when they were introduced, and then she said, "My daughter writes well of you," in a tone that suggested the verdict was reserved but not unfavorable. Over the following weeks, Helen gradually shifted from reserved to warmly approving, a process that seemed to accelerate significantly when Elias spent a full afternoon repairing the chair in Helen's room that had a loose leg she had not mentioned to anyone, having noticed it himself when he carried her trunk in. Helen did not say anything about it directly, but she began making the exceptional coffee cake she apparently made on special occasions, and she made it twice in the following week, and Elias took this as a positive indicator. Having Helen in the household was a different kind of fullness. She took over the kitchen garden with the enthusiasm of someone who had been deprived of access to good soil, and by August it was producing better than it had in years. She was company for Margaret on the days when the ranch work took Elias and the hands far out, and she was, he came to discover, a person of considerable humor and a great deal of stored-up energy that had been somewhat wasted in St. Joseph. In September, Margaret told him quietly one evening after dinner, in the golden late light that came through the new kitchen window, that they were going to have a child. He was very still for a moment. Then he stood up from the table and went around to her and crouched down beside her chair and took both her hands in his and said nothing for a while because there was nothing immediately sufficient. "Are you all right?" she asked, watching him with that particular fondness she had for the moments when he was rendered speechless. "I am beyond all right," he said. "I am just trying to find the words." "You do not always have to find the words," she said, and she leaned her forehead against his. "Sometimes this is enough." He tightened his hands around hers. "Yes," he said, "this is more than enough." The autumn of 1880 continued in its way, harvest preparations and cattle management, and the steady work of a working ranch, with the addition of Margaret resting when she needed to rest, which she did not always do without argument, and Elias quietly taking over the heavier physical tasks without making a production of it, which she appreciated precisely because he did not make a production of it. They had their first real disagreement that autumn, a proper one, over the question of the eastern section of the property. Elias believed the eastern section should be left as open grassland to serve as buffer range. Margaret had decided after reading several agricultural reports that she wanted to attempt a small-scale grain operation on the eastern section, growing a winter wheat crop as an additional income source. They argued about it with genuine heat over 2 evenings, both of them presenting their cases with the full force of their respective knowledge and conviction, and on the 3rd evening Margaret showed him a specific report that addressed the soil composition of creek-bottom land in southern Kansas and its wheat-growing potential, and Elias read it carefully and then said, "All right. You are right about the eastern section." She had been prepared for a longer fight and looked slightly startled by the concession. "You really think so? I think the report is persuasive and I think your read of the soil is better than mine," he said. "Let us try the wheat." She looked at him with a smile. "You are not going to say but a few more times just to hold your ground." "No," he said. "What would be the point?" She shook her head with that fond exasperation. "I love you very much," she said. "I love you too," he said, "and I reserve the right to say I told you so if the wheat fails." "Noted," she said. The wheat did not fail. The winter wheat went in and wintered well, and the following spring provided the first small but real grain harvest that Diamond Creek had ever produced, and neither of them said a word about who had been right. But Elias noticed that Margaret was trying very hard not to be smug about it, and found this deeply endearing. Their son was born in April of 1881. A spring morning when the Kansas prairie was just beginning to reassert its green after the brown of winter, the creek running full and clear past the cottonwoods. The birth was attended by the Caldwell doctor, a capable woman named Dr. Frances Avery, who had come to practice in the town 2 years before, and who had been viewed with varying degrees of uncertainty by the community, and with comprehensive gratitude by every woman who had needed medical care since her arrival. Helen was present and competent, and kept the household running with a kind of focused urgency that revealed how frightened she actually was beneath the practicality. Elias waited on the porch with his hands on the railing and his eyes on the creek and the cottonwoods and the morning sky, and the sounds from inside the house were enough to age him somewhat, and he thought he understood for the first time in a visceral way what was meant when people spoke of waiting for something that you had no ability to influence. When Dr. Avery appeared in the doorway and said, "You have a healthy son, Mr. Colt, and your wife is doing well," he sat down on the porch steps because his knees had made an independent decision. He was allowed in after a few minutes, and Margaret was sitting up against the pillows with the child in her arms, and a look on her face that was unlike any expression he had seen her wear, something that incorporated exhaustion and fierce love, and a kind of quiet wonder that she usually kept more private. She looked up at him when he came in and said, "Come and see him." The child was very small and very red and had dark hair, and was, in the opinion of his father and grandmother, the most remarkable thing that had ever happened. Elias sat on the edge of the bed and Margaret transferred the sleeping infant to his arms with careful hands, and he held his son for the first time and was struck entirely silent, which was not unusual for him but had never before felt so complete. Wallace, Margaret said. She had suggested the name 2 months ago and he had been unable to speak for a moment then too. If you still think that is right. Wallace, he said. It was exactly right. Helen, who had been standing in the doorway trying to give them a moment and failing entirely to make herself leave, came fully into the room and sat down in the chair beside the bed and said, with complete emotional honesty, "He is the most beautiful child I have ever seen," and then cried a little, which she permitted herself on grounds that she had held the household together for the last 12 hours by sheer will, and was entitled to cry now that the crisis had resolved into happiness. Diamond Creek Ranch in the years that followed was what Elias had been unable to picture in those first weeks after Wallace Greer died, when the future of the place had seemed like a door that had swung shut. It was full in the practical sense of a working ranch that was succeeding in its operation, and full in the warmer sense of a place that had people in it who belonged to it and to each other. By 1882, the wheat operation was established and profitable, not richly so, but reliably so, and the cattle operation had grown to a herd of just under 200 head, which for a ranch of Diamond Creek's size and land was the kind of sustainable capacity that made real sense. Tom Sellers had built a small reputation as a horse trainer that extended beyond the immediate neighborhood, and the arrangement had evolved into a small but real partnership, where he ran the horse operation as his own business on Diamond Creek land, in exchange for a portion of proceeds. An arrangement that Elias and Margaret had devised together on the grounds that Tom's loyalty and skill were worth more with genuine investment in the outcome than with straight wages. Pete Sellers had eventually moved on to work at the town's equipment repair operation, which suited his gifts, and he came out to the ranch most Sundays for dinner in a way that had become a standing tradition. Helen's kitchen garden had become something of a neighborhood institution, producing quantities of vegetables that she preserved and distributed with a generosity that had made her genuinely beloved in a community that had initially not quite known what to make of an older widow who had arrived from Missouri to live with her unconventional daughter. The ranch house itself had grown. Elias built a second bedroom in 1882 and improved the porch substantially, and added a proper root cellar that had been on Margaret's practical wish list since the first winter. He built things with the same focused attention he gave to the cattle and the land, carefully and with intention, and the house accumulated the additions the way it accumulated years, solidly, without fuss, becoming more itself. There was a daughter by 1883, a brown-eyed girl who arrived in the fall with a great deal of personal conviction about when she wanted to eat and sleep and be carried, and who was named Eleanor, after Margaret's grandmother on her father's side. Eleanor proved to be a person of considerable character almost immediately, which Dr. Avery said with a straight face, and which Helen said meant she took after her mother, and which Elias simply accepted as a fact of nature that he was very happy about. The community of Caldwell had, over these years, largely made its peace with the fact of Diamond Creek Ranch and its mistress. The practical reality of a well-run operation and a woman who paid her debts and contributed to the community, and was married to a man with an unimpeachable reputation for competence and fairness, had proved more persuasive than any amount of principle about what women should or should not be doing with land. Even Carter Briggs at the bank had become, if not warm exactly, then professional in the respectful sense, because Diamond Creek's loan was being serviced better than half the accounts on his books. There were still people who did not approve, and there always would be. This was 1883 in Kansas, and the frontier was not a place of progressive consensus. But Margaret had long since stopped requiring approval from people who offered none, and Elias had never required it at all, and so the disapproval of those who harbored it was largely irrelevant to the life being built at Diamond Creek. They had a second son in the spring of 1885, named Thomas James Colt, going by Jamie from the first week in the way that small children acquire names different from the ones they are given, and who had his father's dark eyes and his mother's stubborn determination about the orientation of his will, which combination Elias recognized as potentially formidable and certainly entertaining. There is a particular kind of happiness that is not ecstatic but is deep, the kind that does not announce itself because it does not need to, the kind that sits in the grain of a thing the way warmth sits in wood that has been in the sun. Elias Colt had not known that kind of happiness before Diamond Creek, before Wallace's note in his pocket, before a woman with green eyes and a carpetbag had raised her hand at an auction and changed everything. He knew it now in the everyday texture of his life. In the mornings when he came in from the cattle check and Margaret had the coffee waiting. In the evenings when the children were put to bed and they sat together at the kitchen table in the light of the lamp that came through the window he had built for her, and she read, and he did whatever wanted doing, and they talked or did not talk, and both were equally good. In the particular quality of being known by someone, fully and without performance, in the way that only years of closeness produces. On a July evening in 1885, they sat on the wide porch Elias had built, the sun going down over the Kansas grass in that lavish orange way of summer evenings, the sound of the children inside with Helen, who read to them every night with a theatrical enthusiasm that Elias suspected they would all remember for the rest of their lives. The seller's horses moved in the paddock, and the creek caught the last light through the cottonwoods, and the grass went gold and then bronze, and then the color of earth in the failing light. Margaret leaned her head against Elias' shoulder, and he put his arm around her and felt the weight of her, real and present, and looked out at the land that had come from loss and difficulty, and a woman raising her hand at an auction, and a man coming out of a barn not knowing that his life was about to change shape entirely. "Do you remember the first day?" he said. "I remember every day," she said. "I watched you from inside the barn," he said. "When you bid, I could not believe what I was seeing." She tilted her head to look up at him with that smile. "Were you alarmed?" "I was astonished," he said, "and then I was something else that I did not have a name for yet." "Did you find the name?" He looked at her, at the green eyes that had learned every version of him over these years, at the woman who had walked into a barn with her carpetbag and her deed and her absolute refusal to be what the world said she was allowed to be, and who had bought the land she loved and built the life she chose, and who looked at him in a way that he would never, as long as he lived, take for granted. "I found it," he said. "Eventually." She laughed, and the sound of it went out across the summer evening, and joined the sounds of the creek and the horses, and the distant voice of Helen reading to the children, and the million small sounds of a life that was full and real, and entirely their own. He held his wife on the porch of the ranch they had built together, and let the evening settle around them, and felt something he had no better word for than home, deep and permanent, the kind that does not come from a place exactly, but from the people you have made it with. From the accumulated weight of shared mornings and difficult seasons and laughter over, recovered cattle deeds and conversations by firelight, and the particular quality of being loved not for what you represent, but for what you actually are. The wheat in the eastern section stood tall in the late summer heat, and the cattle grazed in the south pasture, and the children's voices rose inside the house, and the cottonwoods along Diamond Creek caught the last light of a July evening in Kansas in 1885, and held it for a moment, the way everything worth holding is held, not forever, but long enough. Wallace James Colt would grow up to be a rancher in his own right, taking over Diamond Creek eventually with the same care his parents had given it, and expanding it to include a proper grain operation that would employ 12 hands at its peak. Eleanor would become one of the first women admitted to study law in the state of Kansas, a development her mother accepted with complete pride, and her grandmother with emotional speeches that grew longer every time she told the story. Jamie would become a veterinarian, finding his way to that work through a childhood, spent watching his father's care for the animals of Diamond Creek, and he would travel across 3 counties doing work that people in rural Kansas badly needed and had previously done without. Helen Hale would live to the age of 78, tending her garden and reading to grandchildren and occasionally dispensing opinions, with a directness that she had clearly passed down to her daughter. And she would die in her room at Diamond Creek in her sleep on a spring night with the window open and the smell of the garden she had grown coming in on the air, which was exactly what she would have chosen if she had been allowed to choose. Tom Sellers would marry a woman named Ada from a neighboring farm in 1886 and raise 3 children in a house on the Diamond Creek property that Elias built for them as a practical gesture that everyone understood was also an affectionate one. And Elias and Margaret would have 31 years together from that February wedding in Caldwell, years that were full of the ordinary specific richness that long love accumulates, years that held hard seasons and good ones and losses that had to be grieved and gains that had to be celebrated, and all the uncountable small daily moments that add up to a life shared at its deepest level. Elias would say once, when someone asked him what the best decision he had ever made was, that it was coming out of a barn on a July afternoon in 1879 to introduce himself to a woman who had just bought a struggling ranch, because if he had waited even an hour more, she might have already made up her mind about the place without the most important piece of information she needed, which was that it came with someone who intended to love it as long as she did. Margaret, when this was reported to her, said that she appreciated the sentiment deeply, and that she would also like it noted that she had already made up her mind about the most important thing before he came out of the barn, having seen the gap in the planks where someone was watching the auction with the particular intensity of someone who cared, and that she had walked in there that afternoon already knowing there was a person inside who loved the land the way she intended to love it, and that this had mattered to her. What she did not say, because it was private and hers, and she was not required to explain everything she felt to anyone, even someone she had explained most of herself to over many years, was that from the moment she had seen that gap in the weathered barn planks and known there was someone inside watching with that quality of attention, she had felt something she could only describe as recognition, the feeling of encountering something that you did not know you were looking for until you found it. And that this feeling had not left her in 31 years, not once, and that she did not expect it to leave her in whatever years remained. On the porch of Diamond Creek Ranch, on July evenings that kept coming year after year, they watched the light go down over the Kansas grass and held the life they had built between them, and it was more than enough. It was everything, and they knew it. And that knowing was the truest and most enduring thing either of them ever possessed.